Truckers' horror tales combine the loneliness of long road trips with elements of terror, the darkness of highways, and the vulnerability of an isolated trucker create the ideal setting for stories full of tension and mystery. These tales not only entertain, but also reflect deep fears, making the act of driving take a disturbing turn. Let's begin. Story number 1, Juan Gebler, the young girl on the road, Texas, USA. I've been traveling the country's roads for over 20 years, living the life of a trucker, knowing every corner of lonely and busy highways. That night, I was driving down a deserted road, lit only by the headlights of my truck. The sky, without moon or stars, covered the region with impenetrable darkness, as if a black, dense blanket had been spread over the world. The static of the radio was my only companion, as there were no nearby stations I could tune into. It was one of those nights when the silence seemed to have weight, crushing any attempt at sound. Suddenly, something caught my attention at the edge of the road. A thin figure stood out against the darkness, barely visible in the gloom. As I got closer, I made out a young girl dressed in a school uniform. Her white skirt and blouse stood out in the dim light, contrasting with the dark surroundings. She seemed no older than 16, and her eyes reflected a mix of desperation and fear that chilled me. I slowed down and stopped next to her, feeling a pang of concern. I rolled down the window and, with a deep voice, asked, "Are you okay? What are you doing here alone at this hour?" The girl, with a trembling voice, replied, "My name is Laura. My car broke down and I have no signal on my phone. Could you take me to the nearest town?" I nodded, feeling a mix of worry and responsibility. I couldn't leave a young girl alone in the middle of nowhere, especially on such a dark night. I opened the door, and the girl got into the truck, sitting in the passenger seat. As I resumed driving, I tried to comfort her with a light conversation, but Laura remained silent, staring straight ahead as if she didn't hear me. The road seemed longer and more winding than usual. I noticed that despite driving for over an hour, I didn't recognize any landmarks. The landscape repeated monotonously, creating a sense of déjà vu that made me nervous. I decided to break the silence. "Where did you say your car broke down? I haven't seen any vehicles on the road." Laura, without taking her eyes off the front, responded in an almost inaudible voice, "You won't see it." The girl's cryptic answer deeply unsettled me. I sped up a bit, hoping to reach a familiar place soon. The silence in the truck became suffocating, almost tangible. I glanced at Laura and noticed something strange. Her skin seemed paler, and her eyes had an unnatural, almost spectral glow. Suddenly, Laura turned her head towards me and, with a voice that seemed to emerge from the depths of a cavern, said, "You shouldn't have picked me up." Terror paralyzed me. I tried to keep control of the truck, but I felt something dark and cold invading the space. The air became dense and the cabin seemed to shrink. Laura, or whatever was sitting next to me, began to slowly fade away, leaving behind a trail of shadow that dissipated into the air. Desperate, I braked sharply, stopping the truck in the middle of the road. I remained motionless, breathing heavily, while the echo of Laura's spectral voice resonated in my mind. I looked around, but the girl had completely disappeared. The road was empty and silent, as if nothing had happened. Not daring to get out of the truck, I tried to resume driving. My hands trembled as I turned the key in the ignition. The headlights illuminated the deserted road, and a cold sweat ran down my back. I drove at full speed until I reached the nearest town, where I decided to spend the night at a service station. I needed a safe place to process what had just happened. That night, as I tried to sleep in the truck cabin, the terror remained latent. I curled up in the seat, trying to convince myself that it had been a hallucination caused by exhaustion. However, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Laura's pale face and heard her voice. And then in the darkness of the cabin, I heard a whisper in my ear, "Thank you for the ride." Terror kept me awake until dawn. The voice was unmistakable, and her presence as real as when I had seen her by the roadside. Since then, every time I pass that road, I pray not to encounter the young girl again. I make sure to avoid that particular route, taking alternate roads, even if they are longer and more complicated. Over time, I shared my experience with other truckers at various rest stops. Some looked at me with disbelief, while others shared their own stories of inexplicable encounters on lonely roads. Each story added a layer of mystery and fear to my memories of that night. I have come to accept that some things in life have no explanation, and that certain experiences are etched in our minds forever. Although I try to move on and focus on my work, the memory of Laura and her spectral appearance accompanies me, reminding me that the road can be a place full of secrets and shadows. So if you ever find yourself driving alone on a dark night and see a figure on the side of the road, think twice before stopping. Not all lost souls are simply looking for a ride. Some might be trapped in an eternal cycle, waiting for the next person willing to help them, not knowing that by doing so, they might also be trapping that person in their own grim fate. Story number 2, Mariano Sintri. The restless soul of the last journey, Triple Frontier, South America. It was a rainy and cold night when I found myself driving along a desolate mountain road. The raindrops pounded against the windshield and visibility was almost non-existent. Fatigue was starting to set in, but I was determined to reach my destination without stopping. Suddenly, during the rain and darkness, I saw a figure on the side of the road. It was a man, drenched and shivering, with a look of desperation on his face. I felt an urge to help, so I slowed down and stopped beside him. I rolled down the window and asked, "Do you need help?" The man nodded quickly and, with a trembling voice, replied, "Please take me to the nearest town. My car broke down and I have no phone signal." I opened the door, and the man climbed into the truck, sitting in the passenger seat. He was soaked and shivering with cold, so I offered him a blanket that I always carried for emergencies. As I drove, I tried to make conversation to ease the tension. "What were you doing out here? This road isn't very busy," I commented. The man looked at me with worried eyes and said, "I was on my way to see my family. I haven't seen them in years, and this was the only route I could take." Something in his tone made me feel uneasy, but I decided not to dwell on it. The rain continued to pour heavily, and the road twisted dangerously through the mountains. Several minutes passed in silence until, suddenly, the man began to speak again. "Many years ago, there was an accident on this road," he said in a somber tone. "A truck like this one went off the road at a curve and fell into the ravine. They say the driver lost control because of the rain and that his body was never found." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to think about accidents, especially on such a dangerous night. I tried to change the subject, but the man continued. "The legend says that the driver's soul still roams this road, looking for help. Some say he appears on rainy nights, asking for one last ride." The discomfort turned into fear. I sped up a bit, hoping to reach the town soon. Suddenly, the man turned to me with an intense look. "Thank you for stopping," he said. "Not many do." At that moment, as I took a sharp curve, the truck skidded. I struggled to keep control, but it was as if an invisible force was pushing it towards the edge. The man, with a calm and resigned expression, simply looked at me. "It's time for me to go," he whispered. And before I could react, he vanished. The passenger seat was empty, and the truck returned to normal. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. I drove carefully until I reached the town, where I stopped at the first service station I found. I entered drenched and trembling, and told the attendant, an older man with a grave expression, what had happened. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You encountered the lost trucker's soul," he said. "He always appears on nights like this, looking for someone to take him home. Since then, every time I drive on that road on a rainy night, I pray not to meet the wandering soul of that man, eternally trapped on his last journey." Story number 3, Ignacio Forti, Desperate Silence. La Paz, Bolivia. I had been traveling lonely roads for days in my truck, transporting a load of electronic products to a destination in the north. It was a clear and cold night, and the road passed through a dense forest. Everything was calm, and the starry sky accompanied me as I moved along the dark path. Suddenly, a detour sign appeared on the road, indicating an alternative route due to maintenance work. With few options, I took the detour, which led me onto a narrower, more winding path. The forest seemed to close in around me, and the sense of isolation grew more intense. After a few kilometers, I noticed something strange. Fog began to envelop the road. As I continued, the fog became denser, making visibility difficult. Soon I found myself reducing speed, straining to see beyond a few meters. That's when I saw it. An old wooden sign, almost completely covered in moss, indicated the name of a town I had never heard of, El Silencio. Curiosity and the need to find an alternate route drove me to continue. The path led me to a small town. The houses were old and decrepit, as if they had been abandoned long ago. I parked the truck in the central square and got out to investigate. As I walked through the deserted streets, the silence was overwhelming. There was no sound, not even that of nocturnal animals. I knocked on the doors of several houses, but no one answered. Finally, I came to a building that looked like an inn. The door was ajar, and when I pushed it, it opened with a creak. I entered and called out loudly, hoping to find someone who could give me directions. To my surprise, an elderly woman appeared behind the counter. Her face was marked by deep wrinkles, and her eyes showed infinite sadness. "Welcome to El Silencio," she said in a weak voice. "What brings you here, stranger?" I explained my situation and asked how I could get back to the main road. The old woman stared at me for a few seconds before responding. "This town is a special place," she said enigmatically. "Here travelers find more than they seek. I suggest you rest a bit before continuing." Something in her tone made me nervous, but fatigue was overwhelming me. I accepted her offer and headed to one of the rooms. I lay down on the bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming. Suddenly, I heard a whisper. I sat up abruptly and looked around, but saw no one. The whispers intensified, forming words that seemed to come from the walls. "You shouldn't be here," they said. I tried to ignore them and walked to the window. Looking outside, I saw shadowy figures moving in the square, barely perceptible in the fog. I decided it was time to leave. I grabbed my things and left the room, determined to get out of the town as quickly as possible. The old woman was waiting for me in the lobby, her expression darker than before. "It's too late to leave," she said. "El Silencio won't let you go so easily." Ignoring her warning, I ran to my truck and started the engine. I drove as fast as I could down the path I had come, but the fog grew denser. The shadowy figures seemed to follow me, gliding between the trees. After what felt like an eternity, the fog began to clear, and I finally returned to the main road. I didn't look back, afraid of what I might see. I drove non-stop until I reached a city, where I told my story to the locals. No one had heard of El Silencio, and some looked at me skeptically. Since that night, every time I pass through a lonely forest, I can't help but remember that strange town and the old woman's words, I hope never to encounter El Silencio again, a place where travelers find more than they seek, and sometimes much more than they can bear. Story number 4. Osvaldo Renoct, The Broken Down Car, Sinaloa, Mexico. I had spent years traversing the country's loneliest routes, transporting goods to the most remote corners. Life on the road has its advantages, but also its dark moments. One particular night, while passing through a deserted section of the highway, I experienced something I will never forget. It was a moonless night, and the sky was covered with thick clouds that blocked even the slightest bit of starlight. I was driving at a steady pace, the radio tuned to a ranchera station that barely came through the static. Everything was calm, just the sound of the engine and the occasional crunch of the truck on the asphalt. Suddenly, in the distance, I spotted a flashing light on the road. It seemed to be the emergency light of a stopped vehicle. As I got closer, I saw an old car, one of those models you don't see much of these days, parked on the shoulder. A figure stood next to the car, waving a flashlight. I slowed down and pulled over a few meters from the car. I rolled down the window and greeted the man holding the flashlight. He was a middle-aged guy with a scruffy beard and a look of desperation on his face. "Oh, do you need help?" I asked. "Thank God you stopped," he replied. "My car broke down, and I have no way to get to the nearest town. Can you give me a ride?" Something in his voice made me feel uneasy, but I couldn't leave him there alone. I nodded and unlocked the passenger door. The man quickly got in and settled into the seat, closing the door forcefully. I resumed driving, and the silence in the cab was palpable. I tried to start a conversation to ease the tension. "What brings you here at this hour?" I asked. The man glanced at me, his eyes reflecting a strange mix of fatigue and something I couldn't identify. "I was just trying to get home," he replied, offering no further details. We continued in silence for a few minutes, but something in the air had changed. I felt an unusual cold seeping into the cab, despite the heater being on. I looked at the man again and noticed his skin had a pale, almost sickly hue. I decided to speed up a bit, hoping to reach the next town as soon as possible. Suddenly, the man spoke again, his voice weaker than before. "There's something you should know," he said. "Not everyone you see on the road is really alive." A chill ran down my spine. I tried to stay calm, but the man's words echoed in my mind. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound composed. I am not what I seem," he replied, his voice trembling. Before I could say anything else, the man began to fade, his body becoming translucent and misty, as if he were dissolving into the cab. Panic seized me, and my heart started pounding. I slammed on the brakes, stopping the truck in the middle of the road. I looked around, searching for any rational explanation, but the man was already gone. Only the echo of his words and the lingering cold remained in the air. I tried to start the truck again, but the engine wouldn't respond. I was trapped in the middle of nowhere with a growing sense of terror. After what felt like an eternity, the engine finally roared back to life, and I sped away, not daring to look back. I reached the next town at dawn, completely exhausted and with my mind full of unanswered questions. In a local cafe, I shared my experience with other truckers. Some listened with disbelief, while others shared their own stories of inexplicable encounters on the road. One thing became clear: I wasn't alone in my experiences. Since that night, every time I see a car stopped on the side of the road, I think twice before stopping. The road can be a lonely and dangerous place, not just because of physical hazards, but also because of encounters with the unknown. I will always remain vigilant, remembering that night when I picked up a man who wasn't from this world, and whose words still echo in my mind. We bid farewell, hoping you enjoyed the video. If you did, give us a like, subscribe, and click the bell to receive all our notifications.